Martin, do you want to talk through the changes that have taken place this year with the funding and things from Office for Students?
Yeah, sure. So we've recently heard in the spring of this year that the UniConnect programme has been extended. So our funding has been extended for another year. So the 2021 to 22 academic year. And that's good news. We're all very pleased about that. There've been quite a lot of conversations with government, with the Department for Education. The bad news connected to that is that nationally the funding for the programme has been cut. So it's been cut quite substantially from £60 million per year up until this point to £40 million per year moving forward into next year. And what that means is that all the partnerships across the country, so ThinkHigher is one of 29 partnerships, and all of them are being asked and put under more pressure to operate more efficiently with the money that they're given.
What does that mean for us, though, with ThinkHigher?
Okay, so the good news is that with a little bit of fighting and digging around, ThinkHigher and the Coventry and Warwickshire area have actually escaped the worst of those cuts. So we haven't had our budget cut by a third, and some of that's to do with the change to the way that the formula that they used, which I think favoured some of the bigger partnerships and bigger geographical areas. So that's been changed, and the result of that is that our funding hasn't been cut too significantly at all. So we've been cut by around about 0.5%, which means that we talk a lot, I think, locally about this project being and the programme being free, but of course it isn't free. And the value of the project for the 2021-22 academic year will be, if we can bring it up on the screen. So it's £456,180, which is obviously quite a lot of money. So when we talk about the programme being free, what we're actually talking about is the schools, your schools, colleges, and your share in a £456,000 pie. So that's the way that I think it's probably quite helpful to think about it. Obviously, that's going to come with some pressures. We haven't been cut as significantly as some other partnerships have been. That's great news, I think, for Coventry, for Warwickshire, and for Hinckley and the areas that we serve. But it does mean that we'll be expected to really show some results, possibly to a greater extent than we have been before. So one of the things that I've done here is I've made a little Venn diagram to show kind of where some of the, I think, pressures, not necessarily competing pressures, but where we have obligations to our funder, the Office for Students. So that's, I guess, the point of putting you in the picture a little bit about where some of our external pressures from the partnership come from. We also exist to serve schools and colleges, and also I think at our bottom line, we're here to support young people in Coventry, Warwickshire and Hinckley to make better, more informed and more ambitious choices about their future. And I think that's the underpinning thing. So the point of my Venn diagram here is just to look at, obviously everybody's got their own point of view and what they want to achieve, and it's about making those priorities mesh and join together, and those bits where we can make the funder priorities, which are about progression to higher education, which are about delivering impact in progression, impact in education, impact in outcomes in the patches that we're working in. So it's also about school priorities, because it's obviously got to fit in with schools' timetables, calendars, and hopefully we should be supporting some of the objectives that schools have. And also to support young people to make those choices and give those young people in the region the opportunities and some of the fantastic things that you've already heard about, so we can carry on doing that work for the young people that we're all ultimately here to serve.
So as it's changed through the different phases, Martin, so with phase one, where we were kind of understanding what the barriers are to young people and trying out different interventions and kind of engaging with schools and colleges and families in lots of different ways, that kind of became a bit more refined in phase two. But as we go into phase three, I know on the data and operations report that's been posted out to people that the 4 different aims that OFS are wanting us to meet for phase three is in there. So I guess that the model of how we're going to work is going to change a bit as we move into the third phase.
Yes, I think we're expected to have learned lessons from what we've already done. We've also, I think, learned a lot of lessons about different ways of working through the last year, 15, 16 months during lockdowns and school closures, we've all had to adapt to different ways of working things, and I don't think UniConnect is any different. So in phase 3, the aims are still broadly the same as they were before. So we're still looking at targeted geographic areas, the same geographic areas as we were before, and they are still focusing on those areas where progression to higher education of various sorts is low, but also where it's lower than you would expect given the GCSE results. So that's been the same from the beginning of NCOP, as it was originally called, and UniConnect, as it was rebranded a couple of years ago. So we're continuing with those aims, but what we're, I think, increasingly going to be asked to focus on is building more local infrastructure. So we'll talk a little bit more later about some of the ways that we're going to work with other local bodies to deliver some of this work. I think we're expected at this point to have learned quite a lot about what some of the barriers and obstacles are. Obviously, the pandemic will have changed some of those things, but I think in other ways it's probably just exacerbated existing divisions and inequalities, and those are some of the things that we need to look at. So we've looked at all those things, and the other thing that we've done moving forward into phase 3 is we've heard from young people, but we've also heard a lot of feedback from schools. So one of the things that I think that we've heard quite clearly is that the cohort of 15 approach that we've taken before it makes sense from a number of perspectives, but actually it's been quite difficult for many schools to work with that cohort and that small size, so separating those out from their whole year group in the way that we've asked to do. We've also heard that, I guess increasingly so as well, getting young people out, particularly again in smaller groups, is getting them out of school and onto a lot of trips is, I think, is something that we've reduced over time anyway. And we're going to continue to try and deliver more of our programme in school. So one of the big changes with what we've called the funnel is that we're looking to use some of our more efficient ways of working to offer more things that we can do at slightly larger scale. So offer things to the whole year group in the schools that we're working with, and we can do that with some blended provision and various other methods that we can talk about in a little bit more detail later. But also we can filter down to classroom size, so we can work with a whole class of young people, whether that's in PSHE or in some other setting in tutor time, and then we can increasingly then filter that down to small groups based on need. So one of our targets from our funder that we spoke about is that we're supposed to deliver what they call sustained and progressive programs of outreach, and that's sometimes a little bit difficult to define, but what it means is we're delivering more than one touch point with those young people and continuing to deliver high quality interventions, and increasingly based on what evidence shows us works. So what is it that has an impact on progression? So increasingly, for instance, we know that doing an assembly, if you do that in isolation, doesn't really have a huge impact on long-term outcomes. So that sort of intervention has to be joined to some kind of more intensive interventions and more tailored interventions with those young people. So what that work in the funnel allows us to do is allows us to work with more bigger groups of young people. Hopefully, we believe that enables schools to be able to tick off more parts of your obligations that you need to report to Ofsted on. So think about meeting Gatsby benchmarks, thinking about Baker Clause obligations, and hopefully the way of working will allow us to do that and help you to do that a little bit more. Those in-school sessions also then build the important foundations of our relationships with those young people. And some of the work that we've done over the lockdowns, I think, has really shown that when we have that relationship and we've got that ability to contact them and talk to them, we can actually achieve quite a lot outside school time as well. But we do rely on having those decent, good quality interventions and interactions with them in school first in order to get those contacts and build those relationships up.
Okay, so in reality, Martin, what does that look like? Because obviously the students that we've got that kind of come under the UniConnect postcodes are spread quite differently across a lot of the schools and colleges as well.
Yeah, so we know that in some parts of the country, young people in UniConnect postcodes are very heavily concentrated in particular schools. So some schools might be 80 or 90% made up of young people from UniConnect postcodes. That's not really the way that our target pupils are distributed here. So we've got this slide. This is based on school census data, and it shows where young people in UniConnect postcodes in our target wards, so the Warwickshire and Hinckley wards are. So where do they go to school? And in particular, because UniConnect still focuses on year 9 upwards. So I've looked on this table particularly years 9 to 11, and we can see that I think our highest percentage is 44% made of UniConnect pupils. So even in our schools with the largest concentrations of UniConnect pupils, they're still less than half of the total school population. So that's meant that we've had to work quite differently up until this point. And our pressure from our funders is really that we must deliver multiple interventions to, they want us to do that with 20% of our young people in our target age groups, which is quite a lot. And this is where some of our blended provision, I think, will become important. But you can see those schools highlighted in red at the top of this table are kind of where our largest numbers of UniConnect pupils are, and that's it's changed a little over time, but I think broadly speaking that's been pretty consistent. So our proposal, our plan for the coming year is that we continue to work with all our schools as we always have done, and that we'll begin by focusing first and foremost on those schools immediately moving into the autumn term that have got the highest numbers of UniConnect pupils. And what that allows us to do, I think, is to get to some of those numbers of young people that we need quite early in the year, and that hopefully buys us a little bit of time and freedom to do some of the later work a little bit further down the track. So if you're in one of those schools, you'll be contacted. I'll probably have already been contacted to set up meetings and book things in for the autumn term. For those schools slightly lower down that list, it doesn't mean that we've forgotten about you. It simply means that we're going to be moving in an order of priority. And we want to be transparent about that and explain the reasons for doing that. So it doesn't mean that you don't get the interventions, that we won't be doing things. It just means that you might be hearing from us in a little bit more detail slightly further into kind of the autumn winter time to set some of that up. And that's the sharing with you some of the data behind that.
Okay, so we've had 2 phases, Martin, already, which is covering kind of 4.5 years. And I know that for some of the schools, they're dealing with an awful lot of paper that seems to be coming into school for various questionnaires. And there's another round of those taking place at the moment with questionnaires being collected. So what's that all about?
Okay, so some of this is about our commitment to our funders, our obligation to our funders, really, to evaluate and understand what those barriers are, what works, and how effective some of our interventions have been. And those questionnaires are designed to explore some of those ideas. So what the questionnaire really explores is some kind of simple questions about aspiration and ambition that are fairly straightforward, but also to produce some scores involving complicated statistical methods based around self-esteem and attitudes to education. So the importance that young people place on learning in school in the relation to their future ambitions. So we've been a little bit interrupted by this. So the idea is that we take a baseline at the start of the year, and then we do a follow-up version of that at the end of the year. Last year's data, which we've been able to analyse, or not me, our statistician has been able to analyse, that wasn't followed up in the summer with an end of year questionnaire, because obviously we were unable to do that for reasons of global pandemic. But the baseline data that we got from that, I think, does tell us tells us some interesting things. So we're going to try and have a little look through some of this without going into too much detail. So on this graph, the red blobs are the UniConnect young people, so our UniConnect cohort, which I called the intervention group on the graph, and the grey blobs are the control group on the graph. And I'm going to come back to a little bit of how that control group is built later on in another part of the meeting, because it's quite important when we think about what data we need. But in broad terms, we know that both of these scores are linked. So your attitudes to to education and self-esteem are both linked to educational progression. So you cannot progress as a young person. It's very difficult to get good progression without those things being quite high. And we can actually see that our UniConnect cohort of young people tend to exist towards the top right of this graph. And what that means is that they are already in the group of young people within your school populations that are most likely to progress based on the terms. So we're not dealing necessarily with a completely even distribution from across school populations, and that's something that I want to come back to in a slightly later part of the meeting. So basically you can see that also that these things do correlate. So if we can improve self-esteem, you can also improve attitudes to education, and that means that we can improve outcomes. So I think what that does is really illustrate the importance of self-esteem, self-confidence and self-belief in that progression, which I think is quite intuitive to all of us, but it's interesting to see that in the data as well. So one of the interesting things that I think we've found is that there's a lot of impact of gender on attitudes to education, and in particular, it's young people who have chosen other or prefer not to say under their gender have significantly lower scores in their attitudes to education than their male or female peers. And I think that's a really interesting and important thing that we need to think about. And that's something that we've, I think, developed some ideas and some projects around in the past, and we'll continue to do that. And then also gender and self-esteem. So we can again see that people who've selected other have significantly lower self-esteem than those who have selected male or female, but also that our female pupil population has significantly lower self-esteem than the male population. And I think as we move forward, this is something we've obviously already seen that, and we know from other literature that self-esteem has an impact on educational progression. So we know that this is important, but that gives us some sense of how the work that we need to do is gendered in some respects. And that's something that we need to take account of, and we've obviously got some project work on that as well that you'll have heard a little bit about that we'll look to build on going forward.
So in the report that went out, are there any sort of main sort of similarities or differences with the rounds of questionnaires that we're doing at the moment? Because I know this was a standalone one for year nines, which is insightful there, but as we move forward, is there any kind of differences with that?
Well, some of it will be about tracking that longer term. So one of our first, in previous years, we've used these questionnaires before, and we found that some of the things that we were measuring, particularly self-esteem, actually kind of went backwards a little bit over the course of the year. And we were only using our intervention group, if you like, for that, so our UniConnect cohorts. One of the questions that I think raised is what happened to everybody else. Is that something that's representative of all our cohorts? Is that something that happens to teenagers over the course of those years of their lives? And that was part of the rationale for doing the same thing with the whole year groups. So I think we will continue to do that. We're going to need more data to understand what that kind of trajectory looks like, both for young people that we don't intervene with and for young people that we do. So I think that's one important thing. I think the other thing that's worth saying is that we'll also look to do some slightly different versions of this using the funnel system that we've used, so that we can see as we go down into higher intensity parts of those interventions, we can start to look at the value that we add and the impact that we add by doing those extra bits, by comparing the larger groups with the smaller ones.
Okay, so up until now, Martin, raise and aspiration coordinators generally ask the data person in each of the schools for various information, mainly about the UniConnect students, and then we kind of look at the targeting and things with that. But I understand that you've spoken to somebody at Warwick in our information compliance department, and we've got maybe a different way of doing things with a data sharing agreement. I just wondered if you could explain a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. So obviously the data sharing agreement will come out to schools for you to review with whoever is in charge of data and GDPR. But what we're looking at is, particularly because we're hoping to do these whole year group interventions, is that we usually collect our data, and our legal basis is something called public task, which is a task relevant to the public interest. And because we have a legal obligation to evaluate, to track the progress of the young people that we work with, and actually also because all of us have a legal obligation to explore the impact and effectiveness of what we do and what we're doing with our public money. So we use that as a legal basis rather than consent. So I know we've many years ago at the beginning of this, we tried getting parental consent back for use of their data, and nobody ever actually refused that. It's just that it went into people's school bags and never came out again. So we didn't get a great return, and that wasn't just a think higher thing. That was a problem nationally. So since GDPR came in, lots of people have debated the best way to do this. We've had lots of legal guidance, and actually collecting this information under a public task is the way that works. So what this gives us is a sound legal basis for us to receive that data and process that data, and also so for schools to transfer that data to us. So what we'd be looking for now would be essentially a year group list with for the year groups that we're working with, and if we can get that kind of full information, we can see some of the fields highlighted here, then that would give us the information that we need in order to be able to work out our targeting for working with the whole year group. We'll then be able to tell sort of automatically how many people in each Uniconnect postcode that we've worked with, and hopefully that will make the process a lot more streamlined for you. That also means that when we work in smaller groups, we'll already have records of who all those learners are, and we'll just be able to update our own registers from there. So ultimately, I think the workload for schools will be much less as a result of this. And that gives us then that basis. There's a data privacy statement that needs to go home from the school to parents to explain that this is happening, and also gives them the chance to object, ask questions, and to withdraw their child's data should they want to. So we need to go through that. It'll be very similar to processes that you already have when you write home to parents and tell them what their data is used for. So census data returns are sent to local authority, for example, and that's a statutory duty. So they'll already be informed about that. So it's a very similar process to doing that, and hopefully just makes life a little more straightforward. It'll make our questionnaire data a lot easier to match up, and I think anybody who's been involved in trying to match up, particularly the follow-up part of the questionnaires, I think hopefully will appreciate the benefits of being able to do it this way. What it will also allow us to do, we talked a little bit earlier on about the way that our intervention and control groups, so our Uniconnect cohort and the total school population, and our intervention group isn't necessarily representative of the whole Uniconnect group. So what it will allow us to do is to look at some different characteristics of those groups, and look at a little bit more detail at finding appropriate matches to compare those young people that we've intervened with at a certain level to those that we haven't as well. So it's going to help, I think, make everybody's lives a lot easier, and also mean that the evaluation and impact reports that we're able to give back to schools and to our funders will be a lot more detailed and a lot more comprehensive and much easier to produce.
Brilliant. Okay, and we've got those templates, haven't we, Martin? So for school contacts, I'll send those out after the meeting, and there's a copy there of the privacy statement that can be sent home to families, but also of the agreement as well that we can have with schools. So I'll send that out after this meeting as well.
Great. And then obviously once people have reviewed that, we'll send out a personalised version. So we have a template version that we'll send out for data contacts to review, and then we can, once everybody's happy with that, we can issue a signed version for each school as well.
Brilliant.